So, I recently made a tier list video of every Cartoon Network show I've seen, and got a lot of comments that didn't seem to understand that basic concept. In that video, I said that the Looney Tunes Show belonged in S tier because I truly thought it was one of the best shows to ever air on Cartoon Network. The show has a certain level of charm to it that isn't present in most shows. I could argue its niche still hasn't really been filled by any subsequent Looney Tunes iteration. And with something like the Looney Tunes, it's difficult to make it unique. Sometimes they try putting the characters in different universes, and that worked sometimes, but sometimes it didn't. One thing they never tried though until 2011 was making the characters more human. What do I mean by that? Allow me to explain. So, if you've noticed, the internet seems to be talking about this show a lot more, which is definitely a good thing. I actually didn't know this many people watched the show when it came out, because at school, when this would come up in conversation, only a few people would even know what I was talking about. But it seems to have made a resurgence with people watching it again, and it seems like I see people quoting the show or talking about it on the internet a lot more again. It's quite a shame really though. This show only got 2 seasons, and I think there was enough creativity that if they kept making episodes with the same cast and writers, the show could still be good 10 years later. But in 2011, when the Looney Tunes show came out, I remember the internet hated it for a few reasons. Actually, no. When you boil it down, there was only really one criticism people had about the show, and it wasn't a very valid one. A lot of people didn't like the show because they said it lacked slapstick. You know, the typical getting hit in the face with stuff and boulders crushing people, things you associate with the Looney Tunes. But here's where I have a problem. Let's say that the show has no slapstick at all. It actually does, and we'll get to that, but for now, I'll grant you that. Let's say there's no slapstick in the Looney Tunes show. Is slapstick humor the only possible way for a show to be funny? Not the Looney Tunes, but just any show, a show. Most people with an IQ above 2 are going to say yes to that. Is it then possible for you to accept that point and realize that slapstick isn't the reason most people like this show? Because I have some news for you. It's not. And even still, with the 22-minute episodes this show spits out, they still manage to have their slapstick too. It's the Looney Tunes, of course they're not going to get rid of it entirely. But what draws so many people to this show is something else entirely. And I'll tell you, if the show's humor were only slapstick, it would not be having the resurgence in popularity it is having. At that point, what would separate it from the shorts of the 40s and 50s? The answer is nothing. Just because an IP is known for being good at something, if one of its spin-offs happens to be good at something else, that doesn't automatically mean it's bad. But unfortunately, when this came out, that was an actual argument people were making. The unpopularity combined with Cartoon Network's awful scheduling made this show last only 2 seasons that were spread across 3 years. And it didn't exactly help that the DVD releases were confusing to say the least. See, when a Cartoon Network show gets a home media release, you can essentially think of it as winning the lottery. Because Cartoon Network was really awful at distributing home media releases of their shows. The Looney Tunes show thankfully did get released on DVD. And I have 2 different releases of it. I have Season 1 Volume 1 and Season 1 Part 1. And they both contain different amounts of episodes. That can't be seen as anything but confusing and deceptive. I'm not going to act like this show was a victim of circumstance, but I'll certainly say that criticisms held against the show didn't help it. Especially when they're not ones that are fixable without changing the show's identity. But that's in the past. Let's talk about the show and how its genius design allowed it to surge in popularity a decade later. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned how I thought the Looney Tunes show made the characters more human than they were in the classic shorts. That's quite an accomplishment for a show whose cast is mostly made up of animals. What do I mean by this? I mean these characters are characters we can relate to. Either we are like these characters in some ways, or we've seen people like them. Bugs is the posh, rich know-it-all who can sometimes get an inflated ego. Daffy is the unemployed slacker who lives in someone else's house. And one of my favorite character dynamics is that of Lola Bunny. She's portrayed as sort of the ditzy stalker girlfriend type, which I might add was perfectly cast. Kristen Wiig is the perfect voice talent for that character archetype, and she does a really good job of it here. And all of that wouldn't really mean much if the focus of the show didn't shine where it did. Dialogue. One of the main reasons people are coming back to this show and why it was criticized in the beginning was because it put a lot more of a focus on dialogue-based humor. A lot of the lines in this show that are a part of passive conversation are actually really clever and help flesh out the character dynamics more than they otherwise would.
Do not patronize me! If there is something wrong with me that I don't know about, then you owe it to me as my best friend to tell me. All right? You're a narcissist? You're a sociopath? You're probably a psychopath. You're paranoid, sexist, and you make fun of the elderly. Those are just quirks!
It's safe to say that the Looney Tunes Show was the spin-off that made these characters feel the most like characters. Like, obviously in the classic shorts each character had its own personality, but one thing that separates the Looney Tunes Show from the classic shorts is that the characters are layered. It's kind of necessary if dialogue-based humor is the style you're going for. For example, Yosemite Sam was a character whose personality was essentially boiled down to wanting to kill Bugs Bunny. That's essentially the plot of most of the shorts he was in, and the formula obviously worked because he would get outsmarted and be at the receiving end of most of the slapstick jokes that were told. But in a 22-minute format, that can't work, and what they did was make him the redneck neighbor who's always messing things up. It leads to some really good jokes and some really good plots, like the episode where he has to move in with Bugs because he destroyed his house. In a 22-minute format where you only to rely on the typical Looney Tunes formula, it would get old rather quickly. If a 22-minute episode were saturated with as much slapstick as a 7-minute short, even if it were done well, most people would get bored about halfway through. Dialogue-based humor allows for breaks between slapstick jokes to allow fully fledged plots to develop. But just because there's a focus on dialogue-based humor, the talent at writing jokes has to be there as well, and it definitely is here. The key is that the Looney Tunes Show takes the original formula and modernizes it to fit a 22-minute time frame, and the situations of today. Just because it was funny in the past and things change, that doesn't mean that it can't be funny in a new way. If I haven't made it clear enough, the splitness of the fan base really hurt this show's chances of success. It had the potential to go on much longer than the 3 years it got, but unfortunately, due to Cartoon Network's boneheaded practices and how misunderstood the show was by certain people, it never got to succeed. The Looney Tunes Show definitely was overshadowed at the time it came out. You have to consider that it was airing at the same time as Adventure Time and Regular Show, which were two of the most popular cartoons in a very long while. And it also didn't help that a more popular spin-off of an old franchise was taking up airtime as well. If I remember correctly, new Season 1 episodes aired on Tuesday nights, with reruns only happening midday, when people are at work and school. Yeah, just because a show is good, that doesn't always mean it was set up for success. You could have the best possible show anyone's ever seen, but if not enough eyeballs are able to see it, that's irrelevant to its ability to succeed. And the real key is to remember how timeless these characters are. If one thing's for sure, the Looney Tunes will always be a part of every generation in some form. It will always keep getting remade, and there will always be someone ready to watch the next one that comes out. The Looney Tunes is such a transcendent franchise that if they put out a flop spin-off, it can't hurt the massive reputation the previous ones built for it. For me, I'm certainly glad the version of it I grew up with was one of the best. Sure, I did also watch the classic shorts, but were I to never see them, I'd still like this version. Actually, were I to see all of them, I'd still like this version. I can't live my life having comparative opinions only, and I think that's something important to remember. One thing I am seeing, though, is that this show is beginning to be talked about online more. Clips of the show out of context are surging in views, and I'm seeing people quote memorable lines from the show. It's good because I don't think enough people actually saw this when it came out. It had its fan base, sure, but as I mentioned, when this show was on Cartoon Network, not many other kids at school had watched it or talked about it. So my recommendation to you is this. If you haven't seen the Looney Tunes Show or you don't think you gave it a fair shot when it came out, please go watch it right now. It is a masterpiece of a cartoon and should be mandatory viewing for any aspiring cartoon writers. But that's it for me. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.